So before I do a cringe announcement thing, how about we go down the list? A little bit of an introduction about ourselves, what we do around here, all that kind of stuff. So let's start off with Guy.
I'm Guy. Most people, if you spend any time in the Rogue Discord, probably know who I am, or at least more specifically in the Outlaw channel. I spend a lot of time in here, usually helping people, talking about potential. Less so now because there's less like developments and like weird like stat breakpoints, talents, blah blah blah. But usually I'm trying to find optimizations for Outlaw, whether it be rotations or gear or stats or something, and I usually help people. And then I also write the guides for Wowhead and Method.
All right, Koji, what about you?
Hey, yeah. So I go by Kojiyama, but whatever. I've been in Rogue Discord since probably the late Legion, I guess, when I kind of main swapped over from Havoc Demon Hunter, and it was Feral before that. I've been doing Theorycraft work for quite a long time, probably back since I was playing Feral. When I came back in Warlords of Draenor, I work pretty much on all the code side of like the simcraft modules for rogues. I work really heavily on the assassination and outlaw APLs. Sub is usually handled by like Missler and Fu, but I pitch in every so often when I see stuff. And generally just try to keep up with the community and answer questions. I usually float around in a lot of the channels, although folks like Guy and Whispyr answer a lot of questions. Keeps me from having to step in too much, but I get a lot of pings and a lot of questions in the TC research channels and stuff. So
just yeah, that's your domain.
Hang out and answer questions, try to help people. Really enjoy theory crafting. I've been doing it for a long time. It kind of keeps me engaged in WoW, so it's my hobby.
Cool. I'm Whispyr. I've been playing Rogue since when I started in WoD. It's my only main that I've ever played. I maintain the assassination guide for Wowhead and Method. I do Theorycraft on the side as a hobby. Obviously not like anything crazy code-wise like Koji does, but dabble with the APL and the general rotational stuff more often. Doing all the sims for pins, FAQ, and all that kind of thing. And yeah, I guess that's about it. To be honest. So, with introductions out of the way, audience is filling up a little bit more. I do want to welcome everyone to the second episode of the Tricks of the Trade podcast. For today's podcast, the topic is called Returning Our Borrowed Power. We're going to be talking about a lot of borrowed power things, PTR stuff, simulations, how we use simulations in our daily lives, that kind of stuff. I'm very grateful to have someone like Kojiyama here, who's very knowledgeable about Sims, obviously. Help us wade through it a little bit. So just to get us started, PTR testing. We had another round of boss testing this week. A couple of mythic bosses. You guys do any of it? What are your thoughts on it? Rogue looking, especially since Sin set got changed and all that.
Do you want to go first, Koji? Or
I unfortunately was not able to join my guild's thing. Kind of conflicted with some work meetings, but I was keeping an eye on it. I mean, in general, things look pretty good. Obviously, we're in a little bit of flux because our stuff was getting kind of bug fixed and changed this week, and still probably some more fixes to come. So I'd be interested. I mean, did you you two both played in the test, right?
I did, yes.
I did the first one, but I wasn't able to show up for the second one. But yeah, I mean, looks okay.
What do you think, Guy?
What were the bosses again?
First
I
one was
actually know.
the Hoovum.
I know none of the raid bosses by name.
The fucking dude with the big orbs that spawn a bunch of ads. All the white swirly orbs.
Like I know them by like concept, just not by name.
Yeah, for sure.
It was the Vigilant Guardian. Oh, okay, I got the names here. The Architect. Okay, so Architect, that boss, I like that boss. I think like it's a little dull though. Like the I feel like there needs to be like one more mechanic in that fight because before the ad spawn, you're kind of just. It feels like not a lot's going on. Like you're just waiting until you get the thing to run out, or clear the bombs, or you're just waiting to get like pushed back and then either use mobility or I feel like I could use like one more mechanic just to make it a little bit more exciting. But I like how big the arena is and how movement heavy it is. I feel like this tier is super movement heavy. Like it feels like a lot of the arenas are massive and require you to move from like one end of the arena to the other.
I mean, I get that impression too. With the Architect especially, that room is so massive.
Mhm.
But I don't know. I felt like a lot of the mechanics weren't like they didn't have a clear indicator at times because a lot of the boss mechanics are literally just like, oh, here's white swirling orbs, here's white swirling orbs, here's more white swirling orbs. So a lot of the times there'd be like a tank mechanic that comes in, like the cleave,
Mhm.
and I just like would not be able to recognize it fast enough because it's just orbs are spinning and then bam, there's the cleave, and you're like, ah, well, I mean, you put up the wall for a split second, so I guess that's my indicator. But it's just rough sometimes.
Mhm.
I do like the choice of which ad you can kill. I always think that like being able to choose stuff like that is really empowering for a lot of raids. Even though most people will probably just look at limit or method or any of those guilds and just be like, oh, we'll do what they do. But at the end of the day, a lot of like lower ranked guilds will have a fun time picking and choosing which bosses they want to kill and which ads they want to keep up.
Yeah,
Was
I
that
thought
the case?
Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, was that the case with Council? I remember killing the bosses in a certain order, and then I said in Outlaw Discord, and people would talk about like, oh, like what's this like? Do you guys know what's the effective boss order? And then people would like other people would answer, and they would be saying a different order. So I'm not sure. But like, do you guys know anything about that? Like for Council of Blood in Castle Nathria, like the kill orders, I feel were different for
Yeah,
like,
there were
different levels of prog.
There were a couple different like viable. I think there were two major kill orders there. I was gonna say like I'm a little mixed on these kind of mechanics because I think the payoff can be there. I question whether it often is. Like we've seen so many over the years where the kill order becomes just super static and it gets solved really quickly and there's really not that much to do with it. I think the Castle Nathria was maybe the most varied of any of the ones I remember. Because also like the kill order tended to be different in heroic when you were doing like speed clear versus like when you were trying to pad because there was like the order that would give you more AoE at the end. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, at worst, it is basically no choice, and at best, it breathes a little bit of
Yeah, because I think of like botanist in Nighthold, right? And I don't think I ever saw that pulled a different way ever in like the whole time of Legion.
Oh
you
yeah.
know? So I think it can be a lot of work for the encounter designers to make all this stuff and consider what happens when you kill in this order and how do these overlaps work, and then players don't take advantage of it at all. So that's why I'm a little mixed on it, but I do think the potential is high for like a lot of interesting mechanics if they can like balance the trade-offs in a way that players will actually engage with it.
Like I said, it's just like at worst it's nothing, and I guess at worst it costs a lot of resources and then also doesn't do anything. But I think it's cool, like just having the opportunity to do stuff.
I know a lot of like heroic guilds and stuff that don't necessarily go for the most optimal strat all the time and like to figure things out themselves. They'll have a lot of fun on that boss. What else did we test since the last time? We tested Zymox.
Oh,
That
there
old
was
boss
also
in
the
background.
other set of testing for Prototype and Vigilant Guardian as well, though.
Oh yeah. What did you did that, right? I don't think Koji or me did that.
Yeah, I did both of them.
What are your thoughts on that one?
So I'm not sure if I'm in the minority, but I like Prototype Pantheon. I One of my favorite fights in BOD was the council fight, the one right after Opulence, where it was just a council fight that was just chaos. And I don't know why I love those fights. So having another complete chaos council fight is just entertaining for me. And it feels like you can use all three of the specs. Like all of them have their own set of advantages. Like for example, like Sin is able to two target very efficiently. Sub has extra mobility compared to Assassination. Can do probably better damage in the last phase. Can more easily switch to the ads that need to be killed, so the circle doesn't get too big. Outlaw also has the most mobility, has the easiest time target swapping, so you can kill the ads easier. And then in the last phase, it's probably going to do the most damage. Hopefully, it's really hard to say because final tuning is going to be all that really matters for which spec ends up being good. But
Yeah, I mean,
definitely
I can say that as a non one trick player, I know I'm in the minority when it comes to the Ravenholt community. I know people like latching on. I've never felt better in a very long time about the state of like Rogue as a whole in terms of options for spec swapping and approaching different fights with different specs and stuff like that. I think we have a lot of strengths across the three specs, and if you're willing to hop between, say, Outlaw and Assassination, or Sub and Outlaw, or Sub and Assassination, or whatever floats your boat, you've got a lot of power to tackle these different encounters and kind of play to the strengths of those specs, especially with the set bonuses.
Yeah, pretty much every spec has something strong about them, more so than just damage. So it's nice that all of the specs are highly tuned and all have their own set of unique strengths that set them apart from the rest. So even if their damage isn't exactly the best, usually some form of encounter design will make one feel a little bit better or have justifiable reason to see play over another.
Yeah, I mean, you never really know, right, until you hop in. I remember, we went into Castle Nathria thinking that Sub was going to be kind of the dominant raid spec, and that was based on beta testing and encounter testing and PTR and all that. And it just turned out, well, actually, Outlaw was just kind of better, and more people ended up playing Outlaw. I understand the people who liked Sub better. It is not like a judgment on the gameplay, but the majority of people ended up going Outlaw, and I don't think that's something we saw coming until we like really got in there and started doing the fights on a weekly basis, and we're just like, oh, actually, I swapped Outlaw these few pulls, and it just felt like it tackled this set of encounters a little better. So I think there's some of that, and especially now we've got so many options, and once we get 4-piece bonuses, we'll start playing around on the fights and be like, oh, well, actually Sub just blasts on this fight because of the four-piece or something like that.
Or like a specific moment in the fight. A spec might be better. Like, for example, on the first boss we were talking about, maybe it's like a fetid situation where you just need to get so much damage so fast that you just have to play Sub because it just has its damage quicker.
Or yeah, I mean that's also a good place where like maybe the Assassination 4-piece comes into play, where like technically exsanguinate effects aren't like damage amps, and they don't really add too much to your damage over time, but it is true that they can do a compressed amount of damage in a very short window of time. So it could be a case where you've got some ad or some mechanic you got to do burst damage within a 10-second window or 15-second window or something like that, and you just go assassination. You just set up all your cooldowns and you sit on your hands for like 2 minutes, and then your raid leader tells you to go blow something up.
Yeah.
Because that's definitely the case of like, yeah, to give the Fetid example, like why I played, saying assassination on Fetid during Prague and Mythic. You get Gale Caller's Boon and you go to your assigned target and you disintegrate it. I didn't like that gameplay all that much. No, it wasn't like the Gale Caller's Xang is a very Marmite mechanic across assassination rogues, but I mean, there's no question that on that fight it was super effective. And a big part of like our strategy was sending like our 2 rogues like opposite ads to blow them up.
So kind of on that topic, trying to move on to the next one.
And the last fight sucked.
Yeah, I tested that one on Heroic, I think.
I didn't really understand what was happening. I just felt like I was randomly dying. I thought it was cute that you fight a monster and then the real boss spawns, but other than that, that's pretty much it. It's like the first boss in the raid, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm not too, I'm not gonna be too upset that the first boss in the raid doesn't have too much going on.
So the tier bonuses that we're getting, kind of alluded to it a little bit, talking about priority damage and playing Exsanguinate for something that you need to blow up. The 4 set for assassination, obviously just being Exsanguinate, but for 20 seconds. That being said, though, we don't really see a shift in kind of what rogues do and how they do it. For the most part, with the borrowed power, the tier sets and the legendaries. I'm not too versed with the outlaw stuff, but it looks like you guys are just doing more of the same. Assassination is just a stronger vendetta. But aside from that, Subtlety is obviously getting some cleave with their 4-piece, but it doesn't really look like there's any big shift in the damage profile as well as how we play with the new borrowed power that's coming up. Do you guys think that is a sort of... is that fine to have just as a tier bonus, just something that might more passively just add more damage, or do you want something more disrupting when it comes to borrowed power every tier?
I think that's tricky. Like, I think there were some interesting things that Shards of Domination teased out, especially when it came to Frost, in terms of like, well, it really made poisons a lot better, and it made these kind of like quick damage things more effective than big hitting things. That was mostly, I think, kind of an oversight on their part, to be honest, about like capping the Frost crit bonus as low as they did. But I thought it ended up being a little interesting for us anyway, because we were able to take advantage of it. Not that many specs were in the way that, like, say, Assassination or Outlaw were able to.
I think it's like pretty much just Demon Hunter, right?
Yeah, it was Outlaw, Havoc, and Assassination were really the only specs using it, right? Or maybe a few other random things, but most were using Unholy.
Probably something like Survival, like something nobody knows anything about.
But like I wasn't surprised that borrowed power in SOD didn't really change much. I don't think we expected it to, but I think there's some expectation for set bonuses that is a little higher than most, just because of historical precedent, as it were. Like, generally speaking, set bonuses do something to change your rotation. I think these probably do to some degree. I mean, Guy, what do you think? I think the Outlaw one is the weakest in this regard, because I just don't think it adds much gameplay.
Into specifically your rotation, or like, can you like reword the question?
I'm not talking about power level here. I'm just talking about like gameplay impacting rotation.
You'd be surprised with It's nothing like, groundbreaker or anything, but adding shadowy techniques to Outlaw, it's definitely different. Because like the way that I've played Outlaw for 2 years is that I'm kind of like planning like 4 globals ahead. Because you can kind of do that because most of the things are like it's random, but it's predictable random. So when you press Sinister Strike, it's either going to hit once or twice, and then you can kind of plan from there. So usually I plan a few globals ahead, and the tier set kind of stops you from doing that. It makes you kind of reevaluate how to count your combo points, evaluate cooldowns. And it's like, but before I'd be at like 0 combo points and be like, all right, I'm going to Ghostly Strikes, I'm going to Echoing Reprimand, then I'm going to Shiv, then I'm going to Between the Eyes, I'm going to Vanish Dispatch. Like I had that like all planned out, but now that doesn't really exist anymore. Because at any point you can just gain 1 combo point and then you have to react to that. So it becomes a lot more reactive than it is right now, even though right now it's incredibly reactive. So I kind of like that. I might be overstating how different it feels, but I definitely like how it plays.
I see what you mean. I mean, I guess I'm more used to doing that because I swap specs so often. So I kind of like fly by the seat of my pants most of the time rather than planning so far ahead. But I think if you've adopted that gameplay style, I could see how that would be like disruptive. It definitely takes like some practice, and I've seen this recently playing carry and sub so often, where you're trying to like plan out when you can use your ER stacks and like having to watch your timers for your shadow techniques procs and be very frustrated when you mess it up and accidentally do like a 3 combo point finisher for no reason whatsoever.
Yep. Well, it's just like, imagine you give shadowy techniques to assassination. Like even if it doesn't really do that much to change, like, oh, I'm going to be building and then spending, blah blah blah. But at the same time, it's also now you just have to think a little bit differently whenever you're planning, like even like 2 globals ahead. You have to rethink that.
But yeah, I mean, I think the design of the set bonuses in general is pretty solid. I think they could, there's aspects of them that I think could be better, but as a whole, I think they're okay. Like personally speaking, I would have liked to nuke the assassination 4-piece from Oblivion and do something different, but it's fine how it is. I like the redesign of the 2-piece was really good.
Yeah, I agree with that. I definitely think that it was a good choice taking it from crit, which is kind of a weird design choice, to just flat damage and then doing it in AoE. I think that was a good change for just the health of the spec. The 4-piece, I'm not really the biggest fan of Exsanguinate in general, or Exsanguinate type effects. But I do think that the gameplay is there, and especially with the snapshotting that's sort of present with the 4-piece and trying to clip Ruptures and Garrotes at the end of Vendetta. It does have some aspect to it that is like a knowledge check or like a rotational change, which I can get behind. I can respect it. I think for a tier, it's perfectly fine. I don't like sub personally. The subset, while I think it's fun in terms of just like, especially in AoE, you're just proccing out of your mind and just hitting finisher, 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 finisher. Having those sort of like moment to moment RNG stuff where you just go crazy and you're sitting there, you're like, oh, so much damage, black powder, like that sort of thing. I think that's kind of interesting. Well, not interesting, but I think that it can be really fun, especially for people who like try to min max as much. But it can be really annoying to play in single target, especially. I was doing testing with it on the worm boss or whatever, which is pure single target. And just finishing and then randomly having half your combo bar fill up again is really awkward as sub. Especially if you're like playing Kyrian and you're trying to hit the echoing reprimand charges. It's just impossible because you're like trying to plan ahead for it, like you guys mentioned. And you finish and it shadow strikes and you're at 3 combo points again. You're like, well, I don't know what to do with this. That's weird.
I find this it's a little funny if you think about it, because the outlaw and subsets are really giving their respective specs a taste of the other spec. in a lot of ways, right? Like
Yeah.
the design for the outlaw set essentially gives outlaw shadow techniques, and the design for the sub set essentially gives sub ruthlessness. And it it's kind of interesting seeing people's take of being like, it's really annoying when you get, combo points back when you do finishers, and like outlaw players are sitting there like, what?
That's great. I love this. This is the best part.
And then on the other hand, you got a guy complaining about shadow techniques, and that's like the core mechanic of what makes sub work, like
Yeah, exactly.
So
I think it's cool.
In that regard, I think it's actually kind of cool to dabble in that, and Assassination's kind of left out, just doing assassination thing so well. Assassination never changes.
Yeah.
So getting to the meat of things, Guy, just one last thought on it before we move on.
Oh, I was just gonna say, if people were expecting brand new rotations, like entirely new global for global gameplay from tier sets, you're probably always going to be disappointed. They add a little bit of spice into the core rotation. Maybe depending on final tuning, Outlaw might change some legendaries, some talents, some conduits, some blah blah blah. But if you're expecting like, I'm going to be pressing pistol shot on single turret rather than sinister strike, it's just never going to happen. The only time like massive overhauls and rotation are going to happen are when like expansions come out, pretty much, or like spec reworks. I think like the sets are kind of do their job.
I can definitely agree with that. Given PTR testing though, we have been seeing a lot of general raid testing, and we have seen people sort of start comparing specs one to another. Like, oh, this spec is crazy, but it's not getting a good legendary. You see that a lot from Subtlety, especially, where they're like, yeah, we're keeping up now, but just wait until we get our double legendary, because our legendaries are 4% or something, and Sin gets a 12% legendary, or whatever the number might be. You're also seeing that a lot across classes, where people are like, oh, Warlock tier is really strong, or Shamans are popping off, and how are we supposed to keep Shamans?
Oh yes, the class that always keeps everybody down, the Shaman, known for their tier dominance.
I mean, Boomkins are the obvious elephant in the room here, but Venthyr is obviously getting nerfed, and Tyrion is looking like they're turning into simps. But given all the comparisons that are being thrown around right now, and all the this is OP, that is OP, do you guys think that it's valid during testing to compare specs at all, given the changes that are happening to sets? I mean, we're still seeing set bonuses get completely reworked, right? So even without tuning right now, people are already throwing around, oh, this spec is meta, that spec's meta, this is most damage. Do you think that there's any truth to pairing and starting to form that opinion? I know that a lot of higher end guilds are obviously making their roster already, so it's an interesting point to see if like it's too early, or it needs to be this early in order to sort of fit the rosters and all that kind of stuff.
I think it's basically a waste of time to make any assessment like that. It's like, people will say, I remember in beta, I was one of them who got, I guess you could say, baited by some of the early sims, or even some of the early raid performance with specs like Fury Warrior. Fury Warrior is supposed to be really, really good this tier. It turned out to be not very good, turned out to be poop. So, I don't know, like every single spec is going to get another probably like 10 waves of changes. I remember, wasn't there some Venthyr Paladin changes this patch? Or in like the newest PTR build or something? Does anybody know?
I believe that was a tooltip change, but the actual thing is changed from Nathria or something like that.
Yeah. I just mean a lot of stuff can, like Venthyr got nerfed, or like the Venthyr Bouncer got nerfed. So much is going to change by the time raid comes out. And then something that people seem to forget is you don't have tier set when you walk into raid. So in the same way that you don't have domination gems when you went into this newest raid, or the current raid, you need to evaluate specs without the super powerful, double legendary, full tier set, stuff like that. Because
Yeah, like guilds are going to be evaluating like the curve, right? And what specs are we going to have in our roster that need 4 set? What specs are going to be okay with 2 set? And that kind of stuff is the type of logistical process that you have to figure out when you're like week 1 rating, week 2 rating, or whatever. Some guilds do it harder than others. If you're race for world first, that's like something you really have to consider, right? Like, how do we allocate our tier sets, or who gets the mythic pieces, or who gets the rings from Anduin, or whatever it ends up being, right? I think damage numbers at this point are whatever. I think if you're spending a lot, I agree with Guy that like if you're spending a lot of time being concerned about damage numbers on PTR, I think that's a waste of time. They're still obviously making massive tuning changes to the sets right now, and until that dust settles, there's like the same thing is like obviously other people outside the rogue community probably didn't know about the changes to the assassination tier set that were upcoming. Like, we've known about it for some time, Whispyr. I mean, you've let everybody in the universe know about it since it hit the last build, or the build before the holidays, right? That this is going to be changed, this is going to be nerfed, or whatever. It'd be easy for somebody who wasn't in the know about rogues to look at like assassination rogues on PTR. Oh man, they're broken.
We need 5.
They're doing 1 million damage. Their 4 pieces worth like 2 piece plus 4 pieces worth like 38%. Like OP, we're gonna get 12 of them on roster. Like, we all know that that's gonna get nerfed down, and I'm sure the same is like true for so many specs right now. Like, I don't go in every Discord. I'm not like stalking Skarzard and Scarlet or whatever, and just like seeing what he's posting about warlocks or survival hunters or whatever. Like, it's so for me, it's like kind of a waste of time, right? It's like I assume other specs are going to get buffed and nerfed and tuned in all kinds of ways between now and when the patch actually launch. Like, what you need to evaluate and what PTR I think is useful for is looking at tool set and playability, right? Like, you start to put together like what we were chatting about earlier about like, oh, well, assassination maybe has this tool set for doing burst damage on a single target that could be really, really high over a short period of time. Or sub is going to be able to do kind of this sustained kind of outlaw like cleave with their 4Ps, and outlaw is, going to have better flow and do like sustained cleave over whole fight type thing. And like you can start piecing together like damage profiles and utility, and of course that's kind of where rogue keeps falling down a little bit. And in a lot of ways, I think it's somewhat irrelevant what damage people are doing on PTR because of that.
PTR should be a place to feel how the tier sets play, how the fights work, and how you can use your specs. You can abuse your specs advantages on fights. That's what I think you should be using PTR for, not being like, oh, my class is 8th on the damage meter, it's dead, it needs buffs, blah, blah, blah. For just as like an anecdote, I guess, is on PTR, I don't have for some reason, my weak aura for my Guardian Trinket just doesn't work. So for basically every single pull, I just didn't use my Guardian Trinket. So my damage looked very bad because I just didn't have a trinket equipped. Or I was saving it for specific like things we needed it for, like the ads on the first boss, sorry, I keep forgetting the names, but like the boss with the ads, the 4 ads that spawn, you have to kill them. Like, I would save Guardian Trigger for that, or the pillars on the council fight. So, damage numbers are basically irrelevant right now, especially because PTR has like so much lag, and specs like Outlaw and I feel Subtlety don't really work very well when you have, like 100 to 200 MS. So.
Well, also, yeah, nobody's playing optimally on PTR, and often like our mindset is different on PTR, right? Like when you're testing a boss on PTR, it's often about, okay, let's see these phases. What do we need to do to like understand this mechanic? So, I mean, you just do completely degenerate things that you'd never do when you're actually fighting the boss, because you're just like, okay, we're going to lust here, we're going to burn this thing so that we can push to the next phase and see the mechanics and get them logged or whatever. So it's
we're going to lust at 128.
Right. It's not like it's a place that's like optimized for testing DPS. It's usually the complete opposite.
Yeah, I definitely had a lot of cobwebs to dust off when I was swapping back to Sin, going to the PTR. But I luckily have a group of people who do testing who are in that mindset of the damage doesn't matter. We're just trying to see mechanics. We're trying to get to the next step. And for bosses like Zymox, we actually ended our testing a little bit early. We didn't do the full hour because eventually we were like, we saw all the mechanics. There's nothing really left to test for us. We could do more pulls, but we're not really learning anything. And so I feel like when you're testing on PTR, even if you're just hitting a dummy, it shouldn't be as much of a focus to like what damage you're doing or how big the boss is, and the ads have 1.5 million HP versus 1.008 million. But I think that it's important that kind of change your mindset from live, and think more about the actual rotation and the importance that plays.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely been times where you sit down on PTR and you try playing a fight as a spec, and you're just like, nah.
Yeah, no, not right now. We'll worry about it later.
Like this is just not working. I've been there. I remember there were a couple fights that I was doing raid testing on Castle Nathria where I like swapped specs every single pull because I was just like trying to find something that felt okay.
Yeah, I was playing a Blunderbuss Outlaw when the tier set was bugged and was proccing like 3 times as much as it should have. Not a spec that works very well. You have too many combo points. You don't have enough time to spend any of them. So
yeah, I mean, I enjoy PTR testing when I can make it, and I think it's super useful for guilds to get an idea of like how specs will be used and how the encounters will play out. But yeah, I mean, to circle back around to the original question, I don't think anybody should be fixated about the DPS right now or the exact tuning. I think ballparks kind of matter, and it's still okay to look at like, hey, this spec is like wildly undertuned compared to others, like the super bottom specs or whatever. Or it's definitely worth pointing out so the devs are aware of like, hey, this set bonus or this class is like doing way more damage than everybody else. That's the type of thing that you get reports from a lot of players about after testing, so they can make the required changes. But all in all, like worrying about 10% or 5% or whatever, that is all just stuff that could randomly change at any point. It's not really worth stressing out about.
Yep.
So on the topic of 5% here, 10% there, there's a lot of clamoring for implementations on Sims, and information, and there seems to be this engine of the community that just never sated and always is hungering for more info, more Sims, more data. Given that we have so many sources of data, we have simulations, we have things like hero damage, Lorgs, which is a sort of newer tool that plans out, shows where cooldowns are being used on your spec for.
Oh, that's a really cool site, yeah.
Yeah, that site owns.
You have things like Warcraft logs, obviously, and so with all of this information that's readily at hand for each individual player, how do you sort of wade through that, especially given the volatility of PTR and changes happening and stuff? Because obviously things are changing every single week with a new build. How do you kind of stay on top of that? How do you tackle it?
I think the best advice is don't look at any of it until the game is actually out. That's my advice to everybody: is don't pay attention to anything in PTR. It's actually such a waste of time, honestly.
I tend to agree. I think if you can compartmentalize yourself and not get too invested in it, it's kind of useful to use in a strategic way. but I do think it's possible to overkill pretty easily on the planning aspect. I get it though. Like the game has conditioned players to think this way in a lot of ways. I know the game designers will probably blame the external tools as they do, but raid bots is an evil now or something. But I think the game design has conditioned players to really go into a new patch hyper over prepared because there's so much like investment choice that has to be made. Like historically over the last few expansions, you have to pick a spec, you have to pick a class, you have to then grind out MacGuffins and reps and currencies for that spec that won't transfer to something else. So players have this like hyper interest in, on day one, I need to know what I'm doing for like the next 6 months ahead of time. And that kind of makes people a little desperate for that information. I understand that point of view because it's tricky, right? It's a tricky thing to balance. And I get that like nobody wants to waste their time. Like, oh, I'm going to get in. I start grinding this currency or conduits or whatever on sub, and then it turns out, oh, assassination is really the meta spec. I just wasted 2 weeks. I'm behind everyone else in raid. It's a real concern with the way that the design has been since like BFA with Azerite essences and all this.
Even in Legion.
Yeah, even in Legion with AP. So I feel like it's easy to fall into that, but I do agree that with Guy that like a lot of that information that you're getting, you're trying to like clamor around and use to make decisions is useless. It's inaccurate, or it's not inaccurate. It's just it's not
complete.
It's not going to reflect the reality of what the state of the game will be when it's done. It's an incomplete picture.
It's the same reason why looking at damage numbers right now is useless, is because it's going to be a different game. And when the game goes live, eventually, it's going to be a different game. I would like, if you want to stay invested and make sure you're not, picking the wrong spec, being behind, blah, 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 just check a week before or 2 weeks before the game comes out. You don't need to be super invested to know what you're doing in a patch. Knowing that the original Outlaw 4 set was a 0.1% DPS upgrade doesn't really matter for progression or anything. So if you feel overwhelmed by the amount of data that you feel or that you might feel towards needing to know for the patch, you don't need anything. You need so little, especially not like the math of the specs with like, I don't know how you do your Sims, Whispyr, but I know the Sims that I did for Outlaw. I took my current character, I manually made a celerity legendary and manually put in a resounding clarity legendary. I swapped none of my gear, none of my anything, and I just said, all right, here's the Sims for Outlaw. All right, this is all the work I'm doing because I don't care anymore. Because it's just a waste of time to collect too much data on how much damage Outlaw does when it'll be a different game by the time I need to actually make those Sims.
I'm a bit of a number monkey like that, and I wouldn't say that I fall into the trap of looking at damage numbers too much, because at the same time, a lot of what I'm looking at with comparisons is like, oh, this legendary is like might be good, like it's looking okay.
Yeah, that's the important part about the comparisons is within the spec. I think when you start comparing spec to spec, especially when we don't all have the same regiment for how we conduct the quality of the Sims, I'm really lazy. But
yeah, I mean, to your point, Whispyr, like I think that's a good aspect of it is like I'm less concerned with the number. I'm less concerned with spec versus spec or class versus class, but it's a good time to answer questions of like, well, now that we've got double legendaries, like we don't know which one is going to be best because they could change the tuning at any point. So I'm not getting too invested in what's best, but it's a great time to answer questions like, what happens when you combine, Duskwalkers with a spec legend or a covenant legendary, right? Like, do we need to change the APL? Do we need to change the rotation? Are there optimizations we can find so that like when the final damage number comes through, we can be confident that that is an accurate number, right? And that I think that's been found. Good stuff there has been found about like, oh, we got to change some sync stuff for Duskwalkers with Venthyr or whatever for assassination, and that's super helpful. That's useful for PTR, right? Like if you want to put in the effort to look at factors like that and try to like, oh, let's see what we can do with the rotation or which combinations of things like kind of interact better. I think that's great to do during the PTR phase, as long as you don't get too invested in it, because we might not end up playing those combos, right? It might shake out that the 4-piece gets changed in some weird way right at the last second, and then some other combo becomes the best like out of nowhere. But it's a great time for investigation and testing, and for tweaking how we look at things. So that's what I try to use it for anyway.
Yeah, same.
Yeah, that's definitely what I try to use it for as well. But I don't know, with a lot of the ways that I set up my spreadsheets and stuff, obviously the number that ends up getting posted or hyperlinked and thrown around is it's this percent gain, it's this number, it's that number. And I definitely feel like I have I guess some blame to go around when it comes to all the number hogging. And like, oh, this tier set is 35%. Like that, I definitely feel like I sort of help foster that in a way by simming so much and having a spreadsheet that shows the gains and the numbers and stuff. But
I think it's more people run.
Yeah,
more people will take that data and then extrapolate things with it. It's like there's nothing really you can do. It's why I always it's why I keep some outlaw stuff just quote unquote secret and like not pinned, because I just don't feel like dealing with the 500 people asking me the same question and then going to other channels and being like, well, I remember now that subtlety's a lot better. People will be like, oh, is sub better in keys because its dungeon slice damage number is higher. It's like no, that it's not a 1-to-1 direct comparison like the.
And like,
yeah,
I understand why people get hyped, right? Like, I don't want to begrudge people getting hyped. They see
how dare people
like
be excited for their spec?
I think it shows their engagement level, and they want to play and they want to do well. I totally get that. And then Whispyr, when you post your 28%, they're like, oh my god, Pog. Like I get that. It's a natural reaction, but like, you just always have to keep in mind PTR numbers are going to change and not to get too invested in it. Like, I know people tend to like, I think I used the term the other, like live vicariously through PTR sims. They like,
yep.
They see the PTR number, it's really huge, and then like they're mentally being like, I'm doing huge damage, I can see it in my mind's eye.
Yep.
I'm gonna be in live, I'm gonna be topping the meters, it's gonna be epic.
Yep.
And I get that, but like, you gotta resist that urge, because it could be we go live that way and it's going to be super awesome. It could be that we don't. You just gotta take it in stride.
Temper your expectations.
I mean, we saw the same thing in beta with like Akari giving combo points, and it's like a 45% legendary.
Oh,
you just see the channel just popping
people
off.
Dude, watching people pretend in that channel that was not going to get nerfed was some of the funniest things I've ever read. Listening to people be like, yeah, it's fine, just look at Balanced Root or something. I was like, dude, what the fuck are you talking about, dude? This is a 40% legendary. In what world does this not get nerfed?
But fire mages.
Exactly. This combust is 1 minute, the damage profile.
Maybe people were right.
Maybe they were, but then you can't. You end up in the cycle of like Spider-Man memes with warlocks.
He's pointing at the other dude.
Warlocks and fire mages pointing at each other, being like, "But fire mages, but warlocks, but fire mages, but warlocks," and then they.
Oh, do you remember that? Do you remember the BFA meme where it's like warlocks. It's like a warlock, an arms warrior, and a fire mage with like expedient, masterful, blah blah blah. And they're like, "Are demon hunters overpowered?" Like, yeah, these are the classes that are the problem. The demon hunters with their they're what was it called? Infinite Stars or something?
Infinite Stars, yeah.
Something like that.
Super RNG gambling spec.
That was great. Take me back.
But
Take me back
Koji,
to BFA.
the top of the Warcraft logs going insane.
Dude,
it's so high.
Our Havoc players in Raid were so depressed at all times that tier. They'd be like, they'd get a pull with like 1 stars proc in 7 minutes or something like that and just want to delete their character.
I love that tier. I got to play, dude, there were so many dumb outlaw builds. Just to talk about how great BFA was. There were so many dumb outlaw builds in that tier. You had like it was like the loaded dice, Brigand's Blitz thing. You had Breath of the Dying. It was great.
Brigand's Blitz was cool. I like that.
Yeah. But anyway, let's talk about Shadowlands.
But yeah, I think this segues nicely in terms of like, you know, what I was talking about like PTR is a great opportunity for us to learn about the spec and figure out better ways of doing things, you know, like, and that's really where Sims and testing hit their stride, right? Of like, oh, we're talking about a good example. We're finding random things about subterfuge setups for assassination. It's not necessarily that we made any mistakes before. I mean, I'm pretty confident that at the start of CN, you know, like what we did with the APL was pretty close to optimal with regard to this stuff. But things change, right? Like the set bonuses come in, they change the nature of things, stats change, you know, our energy regen is way different, which means our combo point gen is way different. It totally changes everything about like nuances about the rotation. And then this is just a good time for us to start looking at that and be like, okay, when you combine like subterfuge with deeper and you've got a 4-piece and you got double legendary, like, do we need to change things about the APL? We're finding, you know, 1% things here and 0.9% things there. And at the end of the day, you know, we'll just have a much better APL. We'll have much more accurate sims when the game goes live. And I think that's something that, you know, a lot of people in the community, not just me and Whispyr and Guy, you know, like a bunch of people contribute, Sev and Vaughn and, you know, like Locktark and all these guys are like, you know, find random things and push and they bring stuff to our attention. We look into it and make the changes and just keep iterating and make things better about our theory crafting and our sims and stuff like that, so that like when things do go live, we can have a pretty high level of confidence that like we're going to be giving people good information.
Yeah,
I think that's a good segue into just like sims in general. Yeah, or do you want more talk about this?
Yeah, I mean we can segue into sims in general. So this is gonna be mostly Koji time, but with PTR and implementations and stuff, how does that look like for you? I know that you did a lot of implementations for not only Rogue, but you also helped out with some other specs, some other classes. So in the day of a life of Koji, what sort of do you look at? What needs to be done? What do you think about when a tier set hits PTR and you're looking?
Yeah, I'm still on the hook for Havoc. Demon Hunters are good friends across the river. I mean, I'm a player like everybody else, right? So of course my first thought when I see something cool is to get excited, right? You know, like I don't think I approach too differently from most players in that regard. You know, I'm a raider, I'm a player. I see cool toys and I'm like, ooh, that looks neat. But beyond that, you know, like there's phase 2 of like anytime a new change hits PTR, like I immediately, after the initial shock of it or excitement, that I'm like, how does this work? So, you know, we'll get a dump of like the spell data, and I'll start diving into what the actual spell data or implementation looks like, because that doesn't always match the tooltip. And, you know, as you know, Whispyr and Guy, and you know, like sometimes we get told things and we start looking and poking around in the spell data or testing on a dummy, and we're just like, actually, no, that's not exactly what this does. So that's usually like second stage for me, is like try to understand how it works, and that's either like if PTR is up, you know, I'll go go blast on a dummy for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, log the whole thing, upload it to Warcraft logs, take a look at the logs, whatever. I'll look at the spell data, and I'm trying to better understand like what are the mechanics of this, because I know people are going to be asking for sims. Whispyr is going to be bothering me within minutes saying, when can I sim this? I need to run my combination of 7,000 specs. Can I have this yesterday?
So true, though.
And I get that. I get, you want to get going on your stuff too, because you've got a million questions. So,
You're just holding them back.
So yeah, my initial focus is always like understanding how it works, so that I can figure out how to implement it in code. And is it just going to work? There's quite a few things in SimCraft, because we've set it up to be data driven, that I'll look at the spell data and I'll say, okay, yeah, this should just work. Like a good example of like the Havoc, the revamp to the Havoc 2-piece the other day, like they changed it to increase the damage of Chaos Strike instead of just Blade Dance. I looked at that and I'm like, no, that'll just work. I don't have to make any changes. So cool. I love seeing stuff like that. That's my favorite. But you look stuff at like the Assassination 4-piece, which took me the better part of a full day. I think I was working on that for almost like 9 hours between testing on dummies, like figuring out how to set it up and like implementing it in SimCraft, because it was super complicated to get all the exsanguinating stuff working with Vendetta and updating all kinds of things all over the place with expressions and APLs and yada yada. So that's an extreme example of like, that was probably one of the most time consuming things that has come up in the last 2 expansions for me. So that's pretty much it. Like there's not too much else to it. Like beyond that, then you kind of go to a third tier, right? Is when Whispyr, starts doing big sims or starts finding things. Or then people have questions of like, okay, well, I was looking at the sample sequence, or I was looking at like the usage of this and that, and with this new set bonus, it's doing stupid things. Okay, that's to be expected. We expect that probably our APL will do stupid things when the conditions change dramatically. When you're generating eight combo points at once, like with the sub 1 and AoE or whatever, like it's going to do weird things. So then you start doing a phase 3 of following up of like, well, how do we need to change the APL? Are there any bugs? Like there might be bugs with the implementation. There might be weird interactions with multiple legendaries or whatever. So it's just trying to stay on top of that stuff. Try to field people's questions and investigate things that people bring up that look funny. That's pretty much how I approach it. It's just a giant cycle, right? You try to get all 3 of those steps done, and then there's a new PTR build and you start all over. So at least for me, like once things hit live, then it's a little more slow paced, right? Like we're maybe doing incremental improvements, Guy or somebody will bring up, hey, what we noticed that if you're doing this with this legendary, that maybe we can change this pistol strike usage here and there or whatever. Like that's the type of stuff we'll tackle like over time during the middle of a tier, but it slows down a lot. PTR is hectic though, because if the build schedule is fast and they're making changes to rogues in multiple builds in a row, it can be a lot of work.
I mean, I definitely kind of get the tail end of that workload, because obviously we sort of have a symbiotic relationship in that regard.
Well, yeah, you got to rerun everything. So
yeah, I just every week, they nerf the tier set again. Well, looks like I have 35 sims to run.
And then everybody's going to ask you questions and ping you like 90 times per day, asking why the chart changed completely.
Yeah, that's why my approach is.
Has this
that's
one
why
talent.
my approach. I was gonna say that's just why my approach is I don't care until the actual game is out, which I'm sure upsets some people, but it's just not worth the headache for me.
Yeah, and I mean a lot of other like theory crafting groups. I know that Shadow Priest, for example, as well as the shamans, they actually have their entire PTR implementation, or at least like their updated APL that they've been working on. They kind of do that all behind closed doors.
Yeah, we're pretty
They keep
public.
that locked off because they just don't want to deal with 50 people going, I found 0.3% of a gain. Is this good? And then, hitting them up like, yeah, we already found that 2 weeks ago.
But then also in this condition with these stats, with this covenant, with this trinket, it's actually a DPS loss. So on average, it's like, it's
yeah. Like I'm happy with the way we do it in general. Like I know it leads to a pain in our ass sometimes, but
we do good.
I think the Ravenhold community is really, really strong in terms of having a lot of very knowledgeable and experienced players. And the information that we do get from people, like some of the folks I mentioned and a lot more, is useful to me. I think it's useful to you guys too, in terms of like that input is very, very valuable and helps us do what we're trying to do a lot quicker. And if it was just like us locked behind closed doors like the whole time, I'm confident we would do a good product at the end, but I think it could be weaker than what it is when we get the input of a bunch of others to like notice silly things.
Oh yeah, half the time when I, find weird things with Outlaw, it's usually because somebody said something weird in Outlaw channel, and I'm like, hey, maybe I should look at that one.
And it might be that they were totally wrong, or they were right for the wrong reasons, or whatever. Exactly. But it gets you looking at something, and that's valuable.
You find something anyway,
right? Like sometimes people find stuff that can be used just as it is, and other times it just puts you on a path. I think Whispyr, you sent me some stuff a while ago, and it was like a pretty reasonable gain. I didn't end up using your APL exactly at all, but it was super useful in terms of setting me down a path of like investigation, of being like, oh, why is this the way it is? And I ended up doing something similar, but like almost completely different, or a different end of the APL. But that's fine. Like that was a super valuable observation that gained us a lot of knowledge about something being broken. I think that was the Duskwalker's Venthyr thing, or Duskwalker's vanish usage, or something like that. I don't remember off the top of my head anymore. But like, we do have a lot of really smart people in Ravenhold. Like another good example of like Push was doing all that testing about like Kyrian sub, and found the stuff with the daggers, which had changed since PTR. I had tested it ages ago. Clearly didn't work with the daggers when I last tested it. And since RNG hates me, I never had any daggers to test with in live. So he was nice enough to do that. But also, like how many sub rogues were raiding at a high level as Kyrian? Most weren't at the time, and that was just like a knowledge gap that we would have had otherwise. And he posted a bunch of logs that was super useful. We were able to do some tests to confirm eventually that it worked, and made that change. And then all of a sudden, we've got 20 million sub rogues raiding as Kyrian the next week. So it's really crazy how stuff like that can happen, and I don't think we would have that without opening up our contributions to the community.
Oh, 100%, yeah.
Definitely. So I guess the one last question that I have before we Q&A, if you guys have any like questions, by the way, there is a community questions channel under the Tricks of the Trade category. You guys can post some questions there that we'll get to at the end. But I guess the final question that I have, Koji, is, in your professional opinion, how do you think that things like raid bots and Warcraft logs should kind of play together, or maybe even clash a little bit in how it affects our actual rotation and our actual gameplay from day to day? Because I know that Sims are, perfect beings, quote unquote. They're not really, but like it's often seen as Sims are the perfect player. They can't make a mistake ever. And logs, on the other hand, especially with externals,
There's-
you got a lot of outside influence, right? So
They're as perfect as the people making them are.
Yeah, right. Which is super perfect, right? No.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, the best. We have the best Sims.
Yeah, it's tricky. I mean, you always have to try to figure out how reality clashes with optimal or theoretically optimal, right? And that's part of our job as theory crafters, right? As well as is trying to translate the theory to reality. You know, we all raid here and we all play the game, and we want that to be accurate as well. You know, like guy likes parsing. I know that. So you know, he's not. He has a vested interest in understanding how to apply the Sims to reality, right? And I think all of us do, to some degree or a large degree, depending on how much we like parsing or how much we get externals, I guess is the case maybe. But you know, like it's interesting because I think, you know, we had to use an example, like we had an observation. I know this was a little contentious, but I think people have come around to understanding why I did it. But we had an observation that, you know, kind of the usage of the shadow techniques procs for sub, especially relative to the carrion legendary, was just not realistic at all. What the Sims were doing was not something a player could do at all. And it wasn't just the like perfect versus like if you play good enough. It was actually just that like the procs weren't accounting for latency and properly, like most of Simcraft does account for latency. But because of the way that like resource generation works and auto attacks work, like this particular case, it wasn't. So I made some changes to like make shadow techniques procs essentially have latency in terms of the APL's like knowledge of them, which is what a player would have to deal with, right? Like our clients have latency to the server. We know there's like basically 100 to 200 millisecond aura lag on all types of like tests on the client. So we kind of did that. And initially, you know, the APL then played like crap. Like our utilization of the Kyrian legendary was awful. So that changed after, you know, a week or two. I found some APL changes that made, you know, some logic that basically brought us almost all the way back to the performance we had initially. Why did I do that? I did that because I wanted players and also for myself to have an understanding of how do we actually play this? Because the way that the APL was telling us that we should approach it was actually wrong. And it was wrong because the environment was not reflective of like playing on a live server. So I feel like by going down that rabbit hole, even though it technically accomplished nothing in terms of our DPS number on our Sims or even changing anything about recommendations, like it's still the same talents, still the same legendaries, now we have a better understanding of how to play. And we're still finding like little bits of like, I think we've got some changes Fu is testing to, change how we pool for backstabs outside of Shadow Dance and using some logic. And we found another small gain there. And I think that's the type of thing, you know, we do on a regular basis. It seems like a waste of time, but that, you know, we always want to take that next step of like, well, how do Sims help us learn how to play? You know, like, because I think it's a really important tool of understanding, like, if we get into situation A, what does that mean? If we get to situation B, what does that mean? And it just gives us more information to try to like play at a high level. So I think that's how we reconcile those things, but we always have to be on top of it. And, you know, it sometimes means that we're like kind of wasting our time, or feels like we're wasting our time in some ways, but, you know, it's helping our understanding. And I know, Whispyr, you've done a bunch of stuff like this too. Like I remember you were doing a bunch of testing on like AoE sims and like time to die conditions on multi-dots, and when you had this legendary and when you had that legendary, and like probably the end result was no recommendation changed for anybody. But we still have a much more accurate APL now, and we have a better idea when we're writing guides or when we're telling people, like, refresh dots at this time, if they have 6 seconds or 4 seconds, or depending on if you've got this legendary or that legendary, it's going to be different, right? And I think that's useful information. That's obviously that's like the next step of theory crafting beyond just like worrying about damage or raid bots or gear optimization.
I was gonna say, even if the sims tell us nothing, they probably tell us something. Like, even if we find 0 damage, we probably figured out that something is either good or bad to do, or we make them more realistic, or it usually results in something useful.
Oh man, the dungeon slice optimizations that I've wasted my perfectly healthy hair on, ready to go gray. The amount of times I've checked for CT spamming. Okay, but what if it's 8 targets? Okay, but what if it's 9? Now that it's uncapped, can we check CT spamming again? Oh, the tier set increases Crimson Tempest damage. What if we spam it?
Yeah, the sims are using Blood of the Enemy wrong.
Oh god.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is an area where people maybe underestimate the work that we do, because like people see the work we do when it gains them damage on sims, and they can share to their peers and be like, I do a bajillion damage now.
And nice damage, noob.
Or when it makes a fundamental change, right? Like when we make a change and then it causes people to like sim a different legendary or a different talent, like they feel that.
Obedience.
But there's definitely like a lot of work that we do on a regular basis that either never makes it in because we're basically null hypothesis testing, right? Like we're testing a bunch of stuff and most of it doesn't work. I know all of you in this call have done this, and I'm sure lots of people who are listening have done this. If they're involved in this, like how many times has Vaughn tried to make Shiv work for Outlaw? I probably infinite times at this point, right? But there might be a place for that, and might end up just being a waste of time. But you never know. And you have to spend that time to know. You have to investigate every so often. You have to like look at Dungeon Slice and retest all the time to die conditions and the Crimson Temp, like all this stuff Whispyr is talking about. Could end up with being like the conclusion is, the APL as it is totally fine. And we feel good about that, when that happens, because we're kind of confirming, our current line of thinking is good. It's correct. But if we are wrong for some reason, we want to know about it as well, and we'll only understand that if we, try to poke holes in it regularly.
A lot of the time, it's also like kind of Mistler alluded to this in the chat, but a lot of the time when we're simming stuff, most of the general population that isn't like our inner circle, or like who happens to be sitting in a channel or watching a stream while I sim, a lot of the people who just aren't that connected with it will only hear about, oh, this is now 0.5% better, this is percent better, and I'd say that like from all the changes and all the testing that I've done, especially for Assassination this expansion, there's probably like the times where it's like, oh, this is 0.5%, that's like maybe 5% of the sims, because everything else is just
that's like gold.
Yeah, like that. When you hit a 0.5% gain, like you're rolling in it.
That's Shiv, baby.
When you see the nice dark green on raid bots,
so good.
That's when you have dopamine
Booming.
hit.
That's Master Assassin killing spree. That's what that is.
But you spend most of your time getting negatives, seeing the orange of shame, right? Like,
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and a lot of that stuff, like you don't even see it, right? Like a lot of people never see that aspect, because there's no point talking about it if it's like 1.5% worse. Like nobody cares, right? There's no point even discussing it, because, well, and I guess it just sucks. My bad, and you just move on. But a lot of the times it's like, well, this is 0.3% worse. But what if? And then you like go down this rabbit hole of like, okay, well, I'll tweak this number, and then it goes to 0.2, and you're like, oh, 0.2. Can I do it? Can I get another 0.2 out of this?
And then you do it again, and then it goes to 0.1, like loss.
Yeah, it's
Like, oh well, no. I'm out of ideas. All right, goodbye.
You make like one small change, and it's like -3%, and you're like, oh fuck.
Yep.
But I mean, that's all useful information in terms of like,
course,
well, like then you start to ask yourself, like, well, why? Right?
Yeah,
like
all of the
because
all of the
it
failures
could
are cool.
it could just be not even related to what you're doing. That's the fun part is like, and I think this is like probably why the subterfuge thing was found the other day in terms of like, I think that line originally was put in, in CN. I think it was a submission from Whispyr of like, because ambush was just worse than mutilate at the time, and it probably had to do with energy and combo points and efficiency and all this stuff, right? And it was a gain at the time, and now it's a loss. Well, why is that? I mean, it's an interesting question. Most people don't care about, right? Like most people just, what do I play? Okay, done. But I think for us, it really encourages us to go down of like, well, now you ask yourself, well, if this was a gain, if I can understand why this was a gain, maybe that means there's more gains. Maybe that means there's something else that's hiding somewhere for the same reason that I don't know about. And as it's like that kind of cycle that we're all on, is the hamster wheel of being like, hey, well, if changing this number gave me 0.1, why is that? Is that because of an energy thing, or is it because of a capping thing, or envenom uptime? And then you find out, oh, this is because of envenom uptime. Of like, maybe our envenom time optimization is bad. Like maybe I'll start going in and playing with the envenom lines, or changing like the priorities on Crimson Tempest versus envenom, and then you're like, oh, actually, I just magically found 0.5. That kind of stuff can definitely happen. It's definitely happened in the past. So even failures can end up in successes in other areas just because they bring more understanding of the mechanics.
It's like a weird puzzle game.
Yeah, like the interactions here are super complicated, and I don't even pretend to understand all of them. I try to understand as much of it as I can, but
Yeah, like
this is a big black box, right? Like there's a lot of things going on simultaneously.
Like for example, I still have literally zero clue how optimizing. Like, so in BFA, there was the Essence Blood of the Enemy, which would just do AoE damage, and then it would make it so you had crit chance and then 5 seconds of crit damage. And then people at the time were saying, like, why does the APL use kidney shot or cheap shot, or not kidney shot, they use between the eyes, or and be like, oh, why is it using cheap shot in the Blood of the Enemy rotation? That doesn't make sense. Wouldn't you just want to actually, buff a damaging ability? I still have no idea why using cheap shot in Blood of the Enemy literally didn't matter. So, like, there's a lot of stuff where you just do it and you're like, it's probably right. I'm just going to agree because who knows? Some stuff just doesn't make sense. It's not worth it to find out how.
It's definitely the case that some things are not intuitive.
Yeah.
Right. Like we get that all the time.
100%.
Like, I mean, Whispyr, how many times do you get pinged per day of like, this sample sequence is scuffed?
It looks wrong.
And then you go and you make your manual change and you're like, it's 0.0% change to make your change, like I know
a lot of the
infinite time you've spent on stuff like that, Whispyr, probably.
The Koji quote.
Yeah. As long as you're just mashing buttons, you're good. Basically.
There's a lot of there's also just like sometimes you'll like look at a sample sequence and be like, oh, this is weird, and then like you tailor the sim to avoid that sample sequence situation, but then that happens 1 in every 100 iterations, and then it becomes a 0.01% DPS gain, and then basically the only reason is that interaction basically never happens, so there's not a lot like enough of a variance.
Yeah, I mean, people do like try to boil things down to rotations and concepts that are easy to absorb, which I get. That's what we do. When you guys are writing guides, right? You're trying to boil it down to something that people can easily process and kind of like internalize. But the game doesn't always play quite like that. We've got a lot of RNG in WoW there's a bunch of mechanics beyond like the obvious ones, and nobody's sitting there like trying to 5,000 IQ, like what happens if my trinket that gives me haste procs in the middle of a GCD and gives me one more energy before my next global. That's like not something a human can think about. But it does happen in the game. And because the APL has superhuman response times, it can do things that a player wouldn't. And sometimes those manifest in random sample sequences, and then people get really confused by them. But then it turns out, well, actually, no, the way that the APL is playing is totally fine, and it's totally reasonable in these.
It just doesn't make sense.
Very specific conditions. It's just like this is a condition that happens, one every 1,000 times, right? Like, and people do somewhat underestimate the amount of RNG in the game. I know we meme about the RNG about like loot drops and stuff like that, or like crits. WoW has an insane amount of RNG. Like every single action you do has multiple levels of RNG, and it could just be about crits. It could be about energy regen. It could be about procs, like just getting secondary procs from other raid members that buff your haste, your verse, or whatever. In theory, change your rotation, but that's not really something like we can plan for, right? Like that's super random, and they're relatively low impact. But when you're running 100,000 iterations of a sim, that kind of stuff matters. So it still helps us understand how to play the game, but a lot of times these small little quirks in the machine don't really impact anything.
And the reason they're doing it is because they're better than us.
Yeah, or it's understanding something that is like really edge case. Like, I do this because I have exactly this energy and exactly this combo points, and there's exactly this duration left on my Shiv buff and exactly this duration left on my Envenom buff. I'm going to do this one global, and you're looking at the sequence like, well, that's stupid. But actually, no, it's not.
Yeah, it's actually the smartest creature ever created.
But, they would probably never come up in a real gameplay situation.
And even if it does, we're unable to actually understand how, why, and implement it to our own gameplay.
So, yeah, that's always the funny thing about sample sequences. Like, and it doesn't mean that it's bad for people to bring up weird sample sequences. Sometimes it's useful. Like, there's definitely been times when we've been provided sample sequences that make literally no sense, and we look at it and we're like, oh.
Yeah, this is just dumb. This is dumb.
I oopsied an if somewhere. That's my bad. I'll go fix that. But I mean, most of the time it is just kind of like weird edge cases that are due to RNG.
So we are coming up on our time.
I was gonna say time for the Q&A.
Yeah. Time for some Q&A. We do have some chunky Q&A questions, I will say. So this might be a little bit of an extended one.
I will say I do have to go to work in 30 minutes, so
yeah, that's fine. We'll try and wrap it up before then. But yeah. So the first one, we'll try and kind of rapid through these a little bit, go a little bit quicker. The first question is, what are our opinions on all the pre-pool cheese crop up lately? So obviously that's sub with Deathly Shadows and now Shadow Dust, and the super degenerate Shadow Dust thing where you have to tome every single pull. I personally think that it's pretty cringe, not gonna lie. Especially for the game that it is, without doing the tome stuff. Shadow Dust is like 0.5%. And honestly, I can't really be asked using it. I don't do any pre-pull stuff. I did Deathly for like a little bit, and then they fixed it, and I never crafted a dust to replace it. I just can't be asked. If 0.5% is the reason why we don't get a silvery kill, it's not my problem. We're holding DPS in phase 1 anyways. Not my problem. Not my issue. I personally think that they should fix all of that pre-pull stuff, but I don't know. There is something to be said about having preparation and like doing things before a pull that I think could. Like, font is a thing that like exists pre-play.
I just think people are naturally going to find ways to do the most damage, whether that be pre-pull stuff or, finding the like just people will find ways to cheat, quote unquote, and do lots of damage. It should probably be removed, but it's kind of like a whack-a-mole game. You nerf Deathly, now people are doing Shadow Dust, and you nerf that, then people are doing that. Like people were doing the Theatar thing with the pre-pots, right? Where they would go Theatar, they would pre-potion on one, then tome swap to Naja to then get the extended potion timer and then get the better soulbind. Like people are freaks. People will do anything to get like 1% more damage. It's kind of impossible to get all of them, in my opinion, or it feels like it's almost impossible to get all of them.
I agree. I mean, I like parsing, and I like stuff as well, and I try to be a good raider. But we get to the end of the tier, and people are wanting to parse and get their all-stars. I get it. So, like you said, people are going to do anything really to get an extra 1% and maybe bump their all-star rating up if they care about stuff like that. I don't think it's all a problem. Pre-pull cheese is something that's been in the game forever, like literally forever. People have been weapon swapping in vanilla. Like I had macros that were built, tied in. It's like a weak aura combo with the DBM pull timer in Warlords of Draenor to swap my soul capacitor trinket on exactly 6 pre-pull so that ICD would kick in right before the ring expired at 10 seconds, and then you'd get a soul cap proc for your ring proc. Like everyone has done this stuff for a long time. I don't think it's all degen, right? Like some of it's fine. Like swapping my soul cap trinket slots, on 6 is not exactly the most insane pre-pull cheese I've ever seen, right? It's pretty tame. I will admit that I think the current one with Shadow Dust and tome swapping is way more work than I'm willing to put into a pre-pull. If only because tomes cost about 1 billion gold on my backwater server. But it's just like kind of too many steps. I don't think Deathly was a problem, although Deathly felt bad because it's an exploit. Like that one was a little bit more clear of an exploit to some degree in terms of like we know buffs from Deathly are removed when you swap for other specs, and it was really just a bug and an oversight that it ever worked for sub because they split out the second
data.
Yeah. So that one felt a little wonky, but it was easy to do, so I don't think anyone really cared. I'll admit I still use Deathly for the same reason, Whispyr, because at this point I can't really be bothered about 0.3% difference between Deathly and Shadow Dust, and I like that it doesn't mean I have to use Slice and Dice during my opener, so I still do it just because it feels a little better. But that's pretty much like all I'm willing to do at this point. I think if the impact becomes too large, I'm not surprised when Blizzard cracks down on it, because I don't think you want the players who aren't willing to do crazy pre-pull shenanigans to be that much of a detriment, because they're the ones playing quote unquote normally, right? Like you still want them to be competitive. But I'm not against people doing stuff to get a little bit of an edge.
It depends how powerful it is. If it's like a 20% gain to swap Deathly, then probably nuke it. But if it's just like 2 to 5, then I don't care. I think it's fine. People will find ways to cheat damage, so just let them have it.
I definitely agree with all that.
Boomkins mess it up every time anyway. So like, what does it matter?
Exactly.
Like
yeah,
Shadow Priest and Boomkins casting on 2, like that's the most iconic duo
Blame
of
the
all time, right?
ranged. It's the range.
Mine is a Hunter auto attack. That one's a big one too.
the accidental right click.
It can be any hunter ability. I don't know how it's any hunter ability, but it's actually any. It could be the pet. It can be serpents. It's literally just any hunter ability. They'll just randomly press it. They'll just forget. Oh, I was targeting something.
Oh yeah, there's been the right click when something is targeted for auto shots like as an issue forever.
Yeah. But next question.
Next question. So these next two that I want to talk about are, again, longer ones than what we just had. So if we can get through them. So the first one is from Sev. He asked, how can you get started with advanced simming and modifying the APL? The wiki is obviously a massive source, but it doesn't help much if you don't know what you're looking for as a beginner. Do you always just message Whispyr or Koji whenever you found a game so they can sim it for you? Or are there resources that I can use that would help me sim that stuff myself? I'll take the first jab at it, because I am actually fairly new to this theory crafting stuff. I didn't do anything really in BFA Shadowlands. I wanted to be a lot more open about it. I think the thing that helped me learn the most was looking at stuff that had already been done and trying to understand what it was that made that tick. So I would see, for example, someone like Koji or Missler post in TC Research or TC Updates, or even just the pins in a spec channel. It'd be like, oh, well, we found this 1% gain. Looking at that and going, okay, well, what is the input that they used from that? What was the before? What is the after? There's a lot to be gained from that. Just seeing how other people do stuff and learning sort of through osmosis. Just being in that sort of ecosystem. But I have obviously also still sent a lot of stupid questions to Koji, where I'm just like, hey, why isn't this working? Oh, I forgot to put a period there. Well, okay. So there's a lot of learning from your elders, so to speak. And Koji's always been open and receptive, and Whistler has always fielded my stupid questions too. I know Fu has also taken a lot of questions that I've had about subs specifically. So I don't want to close it off and be like, don't DM me anything. I don't want to talk to you people. But there is a lot of it that's sort of self-experimenting, and also just if you have any questions, you feel free to come out and DM a question specific to the sim or whatever that you're doing.
Don't be afraid to ask. Be active in the Discord. Ask questions. TC Research is usually where less discussion and more actual data-driven conversations go. Less memes. You can go there to ask questions potentially. You can just go into the spec channels and ask questions specifically, or you can just ask like me, Whispyr, and Koji, people like that. I generally, if you're going to ask me, I'm probably going to tell you how to do it yourself, so that you're able to do it yourself rather than asking me 50 times on every single sim. Not that I, don't appreciate people coming to me for advice. It's just I think it's more important to teach people how to do something themselves than just be like, all right, here's how to, or here you go, here you go, here you go, here you go, because it's important to know how to do it if you care about doing it repeatedly. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree. I think, like Whispyr said, it's a lot of trial and error, right? Getting into it, there's no silver bullet. There's a lot of good documentation around, and we can help. But a lot of it will just come with experience, right? Just starting poking around. So probably the first step is if you're interested in doing stuff like that, just get a copy of the APL. Take it from the profile on the SimCraft repository, or there's ways to get it in the HTML output of the of RaidBots too. You can expand down your profile tab on your sim, and just copy it into an advanced tab and start messing with it, right? And probably, to temper expectations, if you start poking around at it, you're going to break stuff and it's going to be awful, but that's okay. You know, like, that's fine. You just need to sit down and figure out, like, how does this work? Like, how do the expressions work? Just take a look at, like, figuring out the layout of the APL and how the conditions are set up and whatnot, and try to absorb that. We're definitely willing to help, especially people who are interested in learning how to do things, because that makes our life a lot easier. Because we could field, like I was talking about earlier, like, we could field questions all day long of, like, I saw this in the sample sequence, this looks weird. Okay, right? Like, it does that, like, that is not super useful to us unless it's, like, catastrophically bad. Like, if it's like, oh, this cooldown is used in the completely wrong spot, okay, yeah, that's probably worth bringing up. But, like, small things, like, the most useful thing is for you to know, like, oh, when you see that, okay, I'm going to go poke around in the advanced tab and make that quick change to, like, try to force it to do what I think is right. And it might not be perfect, but, like, then I can post in TC research. You know, I was poking around at this APL change. It looks like it might be like a 0.4% gain or something. And then, like, Whispyr or myself or Guy or whoever happens to see it, or what spec it's for, or Foo or whatever, like, can then take a closer look at it and be like, oh, this is because of this, or, you know, then we'll maybe, like, audit that change a little bit. But, you know, it's definitely useful for us if you guys can, like, kind of take that first step of experimentation, you know, because that just saves us some time. I was not joking when I said, like, Whispyr's probably spent infinite time making, like, tiny tweaks on people's wild goose chases over the last year. I've seen him do it. I've done it. I've done plenty as well. Guy at this point probably has the more healthy attitude of just refusing.
It's more so that a lot of
sanity.
it is just, a lot of it is pointless, and I know it's pointless, and because my personality is kind of the way it is, I can just be like, it's bad, just trust me. So I know a lot of the time I'll just be like, yeah, this is probably bad, I'm not going to bother. And, like, it's usually correct when I check later. So yeah.
But why is Iris better, Guy? Oh, it just does more damage.
Yeah. Yeah, it does do more, like, damage.
If you are really seriously interested and not just, like, I know people get, like, dabbling interest, and that's okay. I want to knock that. But, like, if you're actually seriously interested in, like, regularly poking around at the APL, like, let us know, and we definitely help you get up to speed, right? Because, like, having more people who are comfortable doing stuff like that is definitely a positive for us. And we have a lot of people in the community who do that. I mentioned some of their names before, but I don't want to, like, try to be comprehensive because there's tons of them. So it's great for, like, to use a concrete example, like Sev was talking to me about that subterfuge thing the other day, and he was testing some stuff, and he was able to do the validation of, like, this is actually a gain for, like, all the different specs, not just one spec. You know, we have to jump through all these hoops before we commit a change, right? We have to double check it works with all the legendaries and all the specs and all the covenants and yada yada. And, you know, he's knowledgeable enough that he was able to do all those checks for me, and I can just be like, okay, I'll just plop it in. Great. Thank you very much. And that's, in the long term, saves me a ton of time and saves Whispyr a lot of time and stuff like that for guys like him to be knowledgeable about, like, just tweaking the APL to investigate things. So yeah, if you're interested in that, just, like, reach out, and we'll be happy to help you. And yeah, like Guy said, TC research is usually where we, like, talk about stuff like this, like concrete changes to APL or investigations or findings. Less so about, like, random questions. I think we do try to keep that channel to, like, more concrete observations or, like, investigations.
Random questions, or, like, does this thing do thing properly? Asking the spec channels and, like, maybe ping one of us. And then TC research is more like, here's, like, a foundation for something, or here is a finding.
Yeah. One last thing on the topic before we get to the last question, which is, I just want, like, a 1-sentence answer. The last thing is that if you have a gain of like 6 DPS. So it's a rabbit hole probably, and it doesn't really mean much. Most of the changes that actually get put in to the sim have to either like show a difference that like is a meaningful difference to like rotation or something, or it has to be like an actual substantial gain in some sort of way. Uh, if you're like, hey, in the opener, I vendetted with Garrote a second and a half earlier instead of waiting one GCD for Rupture, and it showed a 4 DPS gain. Not really.
Yeah. Also a note: when Raidbot says something is a side grade and has it within like the little blue bar on the side, it doesn't matter if that says plus 0.2. It literally is equal. When Raidbots detect something as a side grade, what it is actually telling you is that it's within the plus or minus margin of error of the sim, because there's always going to be sampling error margin, statistics, and all that. And when you see that, it means they're equal. So it's kind of a pet peeve of mine of when people like post stuff and say this is an upgrade or this is an increase, when it's clearly showing that it's a side grade. Trust raid bots on that. You could run, if the next time you run that sim, it might show minus 0.2. That's all it's telling you.
But it says +3, Koji. What do you mean?
Trust the raid bot side grade.
All right. So, last question, real quick, 1 to 2 sentence. From a technical perspective, what tools do you guys feel like you're missing that would make your lives much easier in terms of theory crafting, simming? What do you feel is the bottleneck at all? If it exists, is it computing power, figuring which input, all that kind of stuff? So, like, would you like something that would automatically make profiles? Would you like a 3080 Ti?
For like, I think less so for I guess like people like us, but just some form of easier use than knowing how to code would probably be nice. But that's like, how would you even begin to do something like, instead of it being like, actions plus equals / run action list comma name stealth comma hits, like these are not friendly terms, these are scary words. It would be cool if like somehow some way it was just like, oh, press blade flurry in this situation, just so like people could more easily like manipulate the numbers, rather than going through this monstrous APL that does look a little scary sometimes.
I will say, though, we do put comments in on the APL that sort of explains what that line is doing a lot of the time, especially if it's one of the scarier lines. So that sort of helps out people who are looking at the APL for the first time and getting scared.
It does, but it's still sometimes I know I was talking to Koji. I was trying to get ambidexterity being used on single target, and I was like, "There's like 2 or 3 blade flurry lines. I changed all of them, and then nothing happened." He's like, "Oh, you got to change this other one." I'm like, "Oh, should have known, duh." so it's not very intuitive sometimes. Which
Yeah,
no fault.
I get it.
It's not the fault of the APL. It's the fault of coding in general.
It's complicated, right?
Yeah.
From a technical perspective, I don't actually think there's a lot of bottlenecks right now. Raidbots has been amazing.
Oh, Raidbots owns.
Like, Seri's awesome. I mean, he's really integrated with the Simcraft team. He's great. The Raidbots platform, especially for those of us on the simming side that have like freebie prio access and our sims always go first. It's amazing. Like the amount of time it has saved me versus doing local sims, especially for like, we're talking about smaller changes, right? Like when we're testing APL differences and we're like trying to narrow down a number of like a duration check versus a buff or a time to die, and like, we have a natural reason to be like, I need to test every number between 2 and 12. I need to check 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 4 seconds, 6 seconds, all these things. And like, I need to know the exact best one because I have to make a final decision about what's put in the APL. Like, to run the accuracy or the number of iterations that I would need to know that locally on my local PC versus raid bots is like night and day. So yeah, raid bots has helped a lot for APL development and removed most of the bottleneck. Like there's still also there's like a computational power issue sometimes. You're running a lot of iterations. They do take time, but it's way lower than it used to be, like way lower. At this point, most of the bottleneck is human. I mean, it's just like hours of the day. It's my own time, my own bandwidth of
Sanity.
how much time I can spend doing, APL testing versus, real life stuff, or even playing the game. Like there's plenty of times where I know I should probably be like farming rep in Korthia, but instead I'm simming because there's a bunch of open questions in Ravenholt, and that's probably not amazing for my progression, but it happens sometimes.
I mean, I agree with that. I think that raid bots is definitely like the thing that is basically all but removed computational like bottlenecks. But I don't know. I feel like most of the problem that I have, which is probably specific to me, is I have a lot of different profiles that I need to sim. I have to sim, every legendary for 4 covenants, and then I need to do that again with, current gear, and then I need to go and set up a gear for mythic, and I need to do dungeon slice, and maybe I have to do some like 5 target AoE thing. And
I could see that like a tool to help manage or save off and generate output profiles could potentially be really useful.
It's mostly just saving it for me. Like I'm very unorganized, and so I just kind of have all of the profiles that I need just kind of loosely scattered through a text editor. I just have like different tabs up, and they just kind of all have their own sort of graveyard of profiles that I use. But I don't know.
I need to talk Missler Fu into updating like hero damage so that on the combinations charts or like the combination tab that you could press a button to copy the profile in a raidbots friendly way.
Yeah,
it would save me so much time. Having to recreate profiles is a pain. Like especially nowadays, like what you're talking about, like I gotta set up all the legendaries, I gotta set up covenants, all the conduits are therefore different, all the covenant soulbind stuff is different, there's a lot when you're changing stuff around due to the way the borrowed power is set up and the legendaries are set up and all that it's very time consuming.
And then you sim all your stuff, and then some dipshit in the spec channel hits you up and he's like, hey, this is using the wrong talent, and you're like, I need to sim all this again.
It turns out that you were the dipshit for not considering it.
True. 100%
and that's where,
true.
Like, that's because like in cases where like you can use Top Gear or something, it definitely saves us a lot of sanity. But yeah, when you're doing advanced sims or trying to do like APL changes, we can't use Top Gear, so like that takes our fun toy away from us, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, Top Gear, woo, saves my life.
It's been a huge one for me. Like not just for checking gear or my live character, just for like I've got an APL change, I need to test it against every freaking combo. Like I do not want to manually make those profile sets. That is a lot of work.
That is also why I don't bother with advanced sims, because they are way too much time.
All right, so this has been a little longer than usual. We usually try to keep it sort of around an hour 30, a little bit. But I hope you guys all enjoyed coming along, seeing the madness. Hopefully you guys all learned something as well.
Always is.
And we'll schedule another one at some point. Keep this reoccurring as things happen. So make sure you're aware, looking at announcements. We'll try and set up events a little bit more ahead of time. I know this is a couple days, but thanks everyone for coming.
Yeah, hopefully it was useful. And I love chatting with you guys as always. It's always fun to hang out with rogue buddies. So
All right, peace.
Thanks, everyone. Hope you enjoyed.
Yeah, see you guys later.